You know, most gardeners are wasting their time with compost piles. Seriously, you've been told that you must heap food scraps, leaves, and yard waste for months just to get rich, fertile soil. But here's the thing. That method often creates more problems than it solves. Slow decomposition, lost nutrients, uneven soil amendments, and worst of all, weak plants. Your tomatoes don't get the consistent boost they need, your lettuce struggles, and your raised beds are basically starving silently under that so-called rich compost layer. The truth is, you don't need a traditional compost pile to grow powerful, healthy, nutrient-dense food. What you do need is a system that works continuously, efficiently, and without the guesswork. That's why I switched to using a 5-layer worm compost bin, 85-litre worm composter for indoor and outdoor. This little setup changes everything. Instead of watching a pile sit and rot for months, the worms do the work for me, producing a steady, concentrated source of nutrients that goes straight into my garden. I'll leave the exact one I use in the description if you want to check it out. But I promise, this isn't about a gadget, it's about practical results. Most gardeners misunderstand how soil fertility actually works. Here's what people rarely talk about. Soil doesn't just get better because you add organic matter. In fact, piling on raw scraps can temporarily lock up nitrogen, deplete soil oxygen, and even attract pests. I've seen backyard gardeners spend entire seasons adding bucket after bucket of homemade compost, only to have slow-growing plants, pale leaves, and weak root systems. The key mistake is treating soil like a container for waste rather than a living ecosystem. Soil is alive, and it responds to consistent, biologically active inputs. That's why worms, not heaps, are the ancient solution that modern gardeners are missing. Ancient farmers knew something that most guides ignore today. You can feed soil without waiting months for decomposition. They layered organic matter in ways that encouraged constant microbial activity, with no compost pile at all. The worms in your bin do exactly this. They break down food waste into concentrated microbe-rich castings that your plants can absorb immediately. It's like skipping the waiting game entirely. Why worms outperform compost piles every time? Here's a reality check. A traditional compost heap loses nutrients to the air, water, and heat. Nitrogen escapes, phosphorus binds up, and valuable trace minerals simply vanish before your plants can use them. But worms transform waste into a biologically active, humus-like substance, packed with nutrients in forms plants actually absorb. I've tested this in raised beds, containers, and even hydroponic systems. In every scenario, beds amended with worm castings outperformed ones using regular compost by at least 30% in growth and yield. And here's a tip most people overlook. Not all worm bins are created equal. The 5-layer design matters because it allows for continuous harvesting. I feed the top layer, worms migrate up naturally, and I collect castings from the bottom layer without disturbing the system. This avoids overfeeding, keeps odor minimal, and prevents the mistake of letting food rot in one stagnant pile. It's the difference between messy, inconsistent compost and a reliable, high-performance amendment system. Stop overcomplicating your garden with endless compost. Too many gardeners obsess over ratios. 3 parts browns, 1 part greens, turn weekly. It's exhausting. And frankly, it often doesn't matter if your goal is healthy, high-yield crops. What does matter is consistent microbial activity and nutrient availability. Worms naturally maintain the perfect balance, eliminating guesswork. In my raised beds, I simply layer the worm castings around plant roots, water lightly, and watch growth explode. In containers, a tablespoon mixed into potting mix before planting is enough to sustain weeks of vigorous growth. Hydroponic growers can even make a diluted worm casting tea for nutrient-rich feed. And yes, it works on a scale that suits you, even if you have a tiny balcony. A 5-layer worm bin gives you the same concentrated benefits as a giant backyard pile. I've had people tell me they thought vermicomposting was just for hobbyists, but in reality, it's a professional-grade soil solution. So, here's the problem with old-school advice. I've seen gardening blogs recommend heaping compost, letting it sit for months and, constantly turning it. But they kind of ignore that prolonged decomposition actually leads to nutrient loss and, honestly, inconsistent soil structure. Even worse, beginners often end up burying their soil with way too much finished compost, which can suffocate roots and create really uneven moisture retention. The truth is, soil needs living biology more than just raw matter. Microbes and worms are what drive nutrient availability. They pretty much dictate whether your soil feeds plants or starves them. Once I understood this, my garden yields shot up without ever touching a traditional compost pile. And later in this video, I'll show you a simple layering trick for raised beds that maximizes worm casting effectiveness. It takes, seriously, just 5 minutes per bed, and you'll see results in days, not months. Let's get practical about how to integrate worm composting into real gardens. For backyard gardens, I place about 2 cups of worm castings per square foot at planting time, lightly mixing them into the topsoil. I've found that this ratio is perfect for vegetables like tomatoes, peppers, and leafy greens. It's enough to feed plants through the first crucial growth stages without overloading the soil. In raised beds, I sprinkle castings between rows, letting the worms do the rest. They naturally migrate into the soil, improving aeration and nutrient distribution. For container gardening, a single tablespoon mixed into each 5-gallon pot before planting creates the same effect. Over time, I top dress with worm castings every 2 to 3 weeks, and the plants keep producing without ever needing chemical fertilizers. In hydroponic setups, I steep castings in water for about 24 to 48 hours, then feed the nutrient-rich liquid directly to roots. It's a simple, repeatable process that saves time, energy, and space. Here's the part most gardeners overlook. It's not just about producing more vegetables. Soil biology shapes plant resilience. Plants grown in worm-amended beds resist drought stress, pests, and disease better because their root systems develop in living, nutrient-rich soil. Leaves are greener, fruits are sweeter, and yields are more predictable. I've had multiple harvests where worm-treated beds produced twice the tomatoes compared to nearby beds, using traditional compost or bagged fertilizers. This isn't marketing hype, it's real-world, repeatable gardening science. A quick trick for beginners. If you're just starting, don't try to replace your entire compost system at once. Introduce a small worm bin indoors, start feeding your scraps, and gradually incorporate castings into your soil. Even a single tray of castings per month can transform a small raised bed or container garden. The results are immediate enough to keep you motivated, and over time you'll realize you don't need a giant outdoor heap to feed your plants. One last pro tip that most gardeners miss. I mentioned earlier I'd share a layering trick. Here it is. In raised beds, alternate layers of worm castings with a thin layer of straw or shredded leaves every 2 inches down the bed. This mimics what ancient farmers did with crop residues and organic matter. The worms naturally move through these layers, continuously aerating and fertilizing the soil. Water lightly, plant directly into the top layer, and you've got a self-regenerating bed that doesn't need compost piles, turnings, or months of waiting. Your soil remains active, alive, and fertile all season long. So here's the takeaway. Traditional compost piles are outdated, inefficient, and often counterproductive. What matters is soil biology, nutrient availability, and consistency. Worm composting, especially with a 5-layer worm compost bin, gives you all of that without the guesswork. You're feeding your soil, supporting microbial life, and ultimately producing healthier, stronger plants in less time than any pile could ever achieve. If you want to grow food that's truly resilient, flavorful, and abundant, start thinking like an ancient farmer. Work with biology, not against it. I'll leave the worm bin link in the description if you want to check it out. Trust me, it's the tool that actually makes this process simple and repeatable. Don't forget to subscribe for more practical gardening techniques, real results, and no-nonsense advice you won't find in mainstream gardening guides. Share this video with your friends who are still stuck turning piles for months. Their gardens will thank you.